Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dr. Arthur Joyce, and I'll be doing the presentation today. I appreciate the invitation to speak at your conference. I do a lot of forensic work in the Dallas area, so I work with some life care planners, mainly on the phone, so it's been kind of fun. I've got to meet a couple of them face-to-face that I've never met, so that's been cool. I feel like, we're relatives, but it's nice we got to meet face-to-face. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, and then we'll get started with the presentation. Whoa. Move that. I've been licensed as a psychologist since 2004, and my background has included over a decade of working at a maximum security state forensic hospital, which is in the Vernon, Wichita Falls area. Before I was a psychologist, I was a registered nurse for 10 years, and so I have that background. And I've worked in private practice in Dallas since 2014. I've evaluated many adults, adolescents, and children with various severities of traumatic brain injury over the years. I'm also board certified in neuropsychology, and I do a good deal of pro bono work with the American Board of Professional Neuropsychology. That includes certification of new applicants for board certification, and also I'm a journal editor for 2 of the journals. So today I'm going to be talking about the functional impact of traumatic brain injury across the developmental spectrum. We've got like an hour to do that, and this is something that you could literally spend 3 days on. I mean, it's a vast topic, and there's a lot of different aspects of it. So I've really narrowed down what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to focus the presentation on automaticity of brain functioning. And so it'll be in 2 parts. The first part, we're going to talk about automaticity, and I'll give several examples of what I mean by that and how it works, as well as 3 aspects of brain functioning related to automaticity. And then for the second half, we're going to talk in some detail about how traumatic brain injury can impact these 3 brain systems and affect both immediate problems, but in particular, longer-term functioning. So there should be some time for some questions after I get finished. So if you have a question, just write it down, and hopefully we'll have a few minutes for that. Okay, let me see if I can operate this contraption. Automaticity is required for generally anything you can think of that might involve learning is going to be directly involved with automaticity. That includes learning of motor skills, all aspects of academic learning, but also some things you might not think of. It also includes things like the learning of various aspects of social functioning that start off very, very simple with mother and child interaction and become increasingly complex. All of that also becomes automated. So there's a lot of different areas that automaticity is important and that brain injury can interfere with. Just a quick example, first of several. Think about tying shoes. This is an incredibly detailed and complex skill that once you learn how to tie your shoes, you literally never have to think about it again. It's an unconscious automatic thing. It really doesn't even take much energy. But if you think back either in your own life or if you watch a toddler or a child learning how to tie their shoes, it ain't easy when you first learn how to do it. It's you have to form a loop, you have to hold the loop, you have to get a good deal of tension, but not too much tension. There's all kinds of skills that are involved just to learn this new skill of tying shoes. So let's talk about a couple of other examples of automaticity. I'm trying to stay not too close to that thing there. So one example is throwing a ball. How does this work? The child that's learning how to throw a ball, the first thing that happens is they see somebody else do it. When they see somebody else throw a ball, they generally form an image that the brain holds on how to throw a ball. And then what's happening with automaticity is your brain is comparing this image, if you will, this program of seeing somebody else throw a ball to the child's own attempt to throw the ball. So initially, they might try to pick the ball up and not have a strong enough grip, or they might grip it too tight and throw it at the wrong time. They might initially not even have the musculature to curve their hand the correct way to pick the ball up. Each time they try to throw the ball, that pattern is sent back to an area of the brain that holds that correct ball throwing program, and it improves, even at just a slight degree, it improves their ability to throw the ball the next time. And so this happens over thousands of repetitions. And finally, at some point, the child learns how to throw the ball automatically. And so by automatically, I mean, they don't have to think about it anymore. It happens with very little effort. They just pick it up and they know how to do it. Another example of a whole different type of set of skills is riding a bike. We've probably all had the experience of learning how to ride a bike. Initially, again, same thing. This involves a whole set of really complex behaviors, and it actually involves something we're going to talk about later, which is scaffolding. And what I mean by that is, to be able to ride a bike, you've already got to know how to do several other things. You've got to know how to balance yourself. And at the same time, you have to know how to pedal. You have to know how to turn your arms in a particular way to steer the bike. And then you somehow put all that together and you learn how to ride a bicycle yourself. Again, this starts off really difficult with thousands of failures. And literally over sometimes a good deal of time, and gradually improvements occur. So we're going to talk about how those improvements occur in the brain. So again, all learning involves automaticity and what process is happening with automaticity. The first part of the process that happens is, again, going back to the shoe tying model, there's an image the child has of what they're trying to do. And in this case, the image is of making the loop to pull the laces to tie a shoe. When a child with traumatic brain injury is either unable to automate or automates much more slowly than their peers, it's only a matter of time before that slower automation begins to take a significant toll on the child developmentally. The child typically becomes further and further behind. So now let's consider what brain systems are involved in automaticity. There's three brain systems we're going to cover, and I want to say at the outset that I've really left out a lot here. So there's a lot of neuroanatomy involved in all three of these brain systems that there's not time to cover with what I'm looking at here. So we're just going to talk about the systems without getting into the detailed neuroanatomy. So the first system is the working memory system. I've mentioned the brain making a copy of the skill, and this is where that happens. The working memory system sees the skill being performed, copies it, and holds that copy in the brain for comparison with what actually happens. The second system, I use this cool pointer, is the reinforcement system. And that system receives signals from the working memory system about what to do. And then the reinforcement system releases the correct behavior at just the right time. And when that correct behavior is released, it's then sent back to the working memory system for further correction. So we've got a loop that occurs in the system. The third system, and we'll talk more about this in a minute, is the memory storage system. Once these thousands of repetitions have occurred, then the memory storage system takes the perfect, if you will, behavior and stores the behavior in the brain. And we'll talk about how that happens and where that happens. Oops, wrong one. There we go. So to say a bit more about the working memory system, this allows initial learning to occur. The working memory holds an image of the skill that needs to be learned, typically from seeing someone else perform the skill. Another example, take a child that's learning to eat with a spoon. At first, they observe their mom or their dad for a long time prior to attempting spoon use. Once they attempt to use a spoon, the working memory system has already formed a copy of what it's supposed to look like. And then that attempt is compared to the copy. We can refer this copy as the spoon use program. The brain then compares the spoon use program to what the infant actually does, and gradual improvements are made. To make these gradual improvements, the working memory system interacts with the second important system, the reinforcement system. This, as I said, this system releases the right behavior at the right time. The reinforcement system receives signals from the working memory system, and literally, they've done lots of research on this. This system receives like literally 10,000 signals at a time, with various parts of the brain sending signals of all the different things that could be done. And the reinforcement system releases the optimal, most adaptive behavior at a particular moment in time. So for a spoon use program, you can see where this starts to interact with social aspects. You might have the mother that's encouraging the child to use the spoon and the child's receiving some reinforcement just from that attempt. And that reinforcement enables or motivates the child to continue trying to do this difficult behavior of learning to use a spoon. At first, they may make their spoon use may be very off. They might be trying to scoop some pudding and they're scooping in the wrong place, or they scoop the pudding and then it falls out of the spoon. And again, we're getting this gradual repetition that allows the improvements in this to occur. Once the child learns how to use a spoon perfectly, then it gets stored in the memory system. Now, I want to say a little bit more about this working memory reinforcement loop that occurs. This is where all automaticity, up until the point that something is automated, this is where all the automaticity occurs. And so the working memory system has the copy of whatever the goal is, and then it sends that copy to the reinforcement system where the actual attempt occurs, and then the reinforcement system sends the resulting new program back to the working memory system. And in this way, through this loop, improvement gradually occurs. Once it fully occurs, then it gets stored in the memory storage system. Now, this system is probably the part of the brain you guys might be most familiar with is the cortex. So the cortex is the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, et cetera. And the memory storage system stores this new program, not in one particular area of the brain, but in a distributed network. So there's not some spoon use area of the brain that anybody could identify, but rather sensory, perceptual, emotional, motivational factors all work together in this distributed network. And whenever it's needed, the spoon use program gets called up. Now, what's interesting is once this spoon use program is automated, it can then be used for other types of programs that aren't the same, but that are similar. So when a child's learning to use a fork, they aren't completely clueless about what it means to use a fork if they've automated using a spoon. Even though they're very different, they both involve using a utensil and they both involve eating. So initially, when you're learn to use a fork, you call up that spoon use program, and that's how you first start trying to use a fork, is like a spoon. And then it gradually, again, that same process we talked about starts to improve the fork use program until it becomes fully automated. A completely different example, which we're going to talk about in more detail, is mathematics skills. With mathematics, the skill of counting to 10 forms a building block for all other mathematics skills. And so a child that has trouble counting to 10, or to put it in the terms we're talking about here today, is unable to fully automate counting to 10, is obviously going to have a lot of difficulty when they and their peers are now trying to learn addition. So what kind of difficulty are they going to have? They're going to be counting much more slowly than their peers because it's not automated, and they're going to be having to use a lot more effort than their peers are. So we're going to talk more about the implications of that, but I want you to keep that in mind, because that slowness and increased effort can be applied in a lot of different areas when something's not fully automated. And it can help us to understand what are the implications for functional development on down the road. So let's talk about mathematics in more detail. How do you learn how to count to 10? The first thing that happens is there's an association that occurs between sound and meaning. So that association of the word one gets associated with practical examples in the real world of what that sound starts to mean. So mom does little games with the child to help them learn how to count initially, but those games are actually helping a complex process go on. I mean, if a parent is playing with the child and saying with their toes, one little piggy went to market, two little piggies stayed home, that seems like a fun little game, but actually the child is associating that sound of one with one finger or one toe. And that's how that learning process starts to work. When they first hear that association, it doesn't mean anything to them. But again, the repetition is where that learning occurs. And it's the same type of automaticity learning that we talked about with motor learning. So the same thing is happening with these reinforcement systems and working memory systems. Yeah, so I also want to mention that there's another type of automaticity that starts to occur when learning math skills. So you've learned these counting 1 to 10, and then you start learning how to add. And so another type of automaticity is learning rules rules of different sorts that apply to mathematics. So, for example, there's a rule about carrying from the ones column to the tens column. So all of those different rules work together, and they're all automated and they're able to be called up easily and quickly by a child that doesn't have interference with automaticity. Okay, so just summarizing this first part of what we've talked about, it's important to understand there's a scaffolding involved in learning any new skill, and that scaffolding affects just about every type of learning, from language to mathematics to social interactions to emotion regulation, which we'll talk more about in a moment as well. For each of these areas, we could work our way backwards and identify the skills that are involved, the precursor skills that are involved in learning any new skill. All of those precursor skills at one point weren't known either, and they had to be automated and learned, and then they work together to learn a new skill. When something happens to the developing brain, aspects of these brain systems necessary for automaticity are typically interfered with. Furthermore, the integrity of these systems can be evaluated in a neuropsychological evaluation, which combines standardized testing of these three brain systems with rating scales that provide information about development and developmental delays. So for the rest of the presentation, we're going to focus on the impact of traumatic brain injury on automaticity. So first of all, it's important to know that even small areas of injury from a TBI can have a large impact on functioning. And just, I'm assuming everybody knows this, but just in case there's some new life care planner counselors out here that don't know it, a traumatic brain injury typically involves some level of force to the brain that causes a level of injury. TBIs are classified as mild, moderate, or severe based on some classifications that have been accepted in rehab psychology and in neuropsychology. Although many professionals believe a mild TBI corresponds to a time-limited impact of 3 months or less, we're now seeing a good deal of research that shows that traumatic brain injury, even at the mild level, at least some of the time causes longer term impacts. So that's important to understand. There are various areas that can be interfered with, including primary frontal motor cortex, which can send faulty signals to the working memory system. That system involves the cerebellum interacting with the frontal cortex. And also the reinforcement system can receive these faulty signals. When they're working with faulty signals, then the automaticity aspect doesn't occur the way that it's supposed to, and it interferes with long-term functioning. Looking at a more complex idea, consider the automatic aspects of language and conversation. When language and speech centers are impacted by traumatic brain injury, the child may not develop the automatic language patterns that are necessary for language and social functioning. Because certain language functions are never automated to begin with, a cascade of impacts can occur that interfere with social and academic functioning. So we're going to shift to talk about how TBI impacts the working memory system. So for example, if you have evidence, for example, on a neuropsychological evaluation of visual working memory impairment or verbal working memory impairment after a TBI, the working memory deficit is very likely to interfere with some aspects of automaticity. When working memory deficits are found on standardized testing and then are combined with significant adaptive functioning delays, we can begin to identify potential patterns that can interfere with long-term functioning. So traumatic brain injury in the reinforcement system. The integrity of the reinforcement system can also be evaluated with neuropsychological tests. In particular, tests that are known as continuous performance tests can provide a good deal of information about the reinforcement system. Probably the most well-known of those tests is called the Connors CPT. It provides information about a child's or an adult's intentions. So things like knowing when not to start a behavior. So that might include knowing when not to start playing a video game when you're supposed to be working on a school project or on homework, knowing not to start making other kids laugh in class right at the same time the teacher's talking to the class. There's also knowing when to persist with a behavior, staying with the behavior as long as needed until it's completed. Also knowing when to stop a behavior. That would involve knowing when to move from one behavior or activity to another. When a TBI causes damage to the brain's reinforcement system, problems occur with these intention programs and interfere with this reinforcement system. These intention problems directly impact skill building and new learning. For example, a 10-year-old who's distracted in class and responding to extraneous, irrelevant stimuli is going to have difficulty improving a particular skill because they're distracted and not focused. We see this with attention deficit disorder, and we also see similar types of attention problems with traumatic brain injury. When the motivational aspects of the reinforcement system are interfered with, the child may lack the motivation for new learning, a different type of problem. They might be highly motivated to perform known or habitual patterns of behavior, such as playing a video game that they're really good at, but they might be much less interested in doing something that's new or difficult, such as trying to learn and automate a new skill. A child who has problems inhibiting their responses to irrelevant stimuli are likely to have difficulties with emotional regulation and self-motivation. In addition, children with nonverbal working memory problems are likely to have less confidence in their ability to control their body and space. They're not going to do as well in group games or team sports. They're going to often be clumsier than their peers, and they're not going to improve and automate certain motor skills as easily as their peers. The sense of being different from their peers, even though it's a sensory motor problem, often impacts a child emotionally as well. A common result can be that TBI impacts a child and causes a child to withdraw from peers or from recreational and social activities or from activities they view as challenging. This is where you talk to a child who's like, well, how's school going for you? I hate school. There's nothing I like about school. There's often nothing I like about it because they're performing tasks more slowly than their peers with more effort. And so it's unpleasant. They're getting negative feedback and you get a kind of a vicious cycle there. Children with brain injury impacting verbal working memory are also likely to have problems with emotional and motivational states. Verbal working memory is very necessary for internal rehearsal. For example, rehearsing alternative verbal responses that could be used. They have an interaction with somebody, and then your verbal working memory is used to think through, well, what could I have done? What could I have said that I didn't? And that is generally does two things. One, it helps us to develop and build a sense of self, and it also helps us to adapt to challenging situations. When you have verbal working memory problems, then it's not as easy to engage in that activity, and so your adaptation is impacted in that way. So the child with verbal working memory problems are likely to struggle with learning new emotional responses. And again, their motivation is commonly impacted, resulting in increased frustration and having an awareness of their differences from their peers. The memory storage system can also be impacted by traumatic brain injury. This is typically indirect rather than direct. And the reason for that is a direct impact on the memory storage system. You may have heard of the hippocampal system. That's the primary memory storage system. If it's directly impacted by an injury, it's typically because you've got a severe brain injury. That's generally because that area of the brain is more towards the center of the brain, and it's not as likely as some other areas to be impacted, in particular by mild traumatic brain injury. Indirect impacts, though, are much more common, and those indirect impacts go back to what I mentioned earlier, in that, say you have an impact on the primary motor cortex, and you're not going to be able to automate motor behaviors as easily just because there's going to be some bad signaling and not the correct action going on in response to signals from that automaticity system that corrects and improves behavior. So now I want to consider the implications of these problems with automaticity. Think about the child that has trouble counting that we talked about earlier. Now that child's going from kindergarten into the first grade. And so what's happening is they're still having some trouble counting. They can do it, but they're slow and it's not automated. And their peers have automated counting, and now they're learning addition. And so just to make this clear, the child that doesn't have counting automated, it's not that they can't learn addition, it's that it's going to be much, much harder and much, much more effort and much less reinforcing. It's just going to be a lot of work, and it's going to stay a lot of work until they can automate those more basic skills. And so from there, I hope one of the things you can start to see is that there's a separation that commonly occurs, certainly with moderate and severe brain injury in children, but also depending on how it affects, sometimes with mild injury too. As we go from the first grade, now we're in the second grade, now we're in the third grade. And so what you tend to see is their peers are having this progress. They're automating addition and subtraction. Now they're learning division. Now they're learning multiplication, while a child with a severe injury still doesn't have these more basic skills automated. So that's part of what goes on with these profound implications of automaticity problems. So hopefully that makes some sense in that regard. Now let's consider that same child moving into adulthood. What can we say about that? And again, we're focusing on one area of how it interferes with math functioning, but one of the things I hope you'll do is you can expand this to, there's a lot of different areas this can impact, but just talking about math functioning, what are you going to see in an adult who's never really automated these skills the way that it normally happens for humans? At a practical level, their ability to perform basic calculations can be impacted. They might not be able to balance a checkbook very well. They might have difficulty understanding taxes or understanding information in a paycheck. all because they've never familiarized themselves or understood the various aspects of mathematics and then the practical aspects of mathematics in real world functioning. In addition, even more broadly, these can impact self-regulation skills. This can be quite profound. The child may have significant problems because of their experiences with being delayed with these math skills or with academic skills in general. And so they may have developed a way to adapt to that. That adaptation commonly involves a type of social withdrawal where they avoid certain challenging aspects because they sometimes can lose confidence in their own abilities to solve certain types of problems. Now, I'm talking in general terms here, and it's important to understand that this is going to look differently for every individual, right? So it's not, we can't say it's a broad stroke we can apply to everybody, but it is true that these automaticity problems are very likely to interfere in some way with a child's development as they move on into adolescence and into adulthood. In work settings, problems with automaticity commonly impact the rate of work completion, such that the adult with automaticity problems may have trouble completing tasks. They may complete tasks more slowly, and they're often are making more mistakes than their peers that do not have these difficulties. Traumatic brain injury that causes even subtle impacts on verbal working memory may cause an adult worker to have problems like losing track of directions or difficulty carrying out a series of instructions that involve more than one or two steps. The level of impairment in the adult with childhood TBI typically corresponds to the type and severity of traumatic brain injury. I thank everybody for attending this presentation. My hope is that the presentations provided you with a general understanding of some ways that self-regulation can interfere with a child's development and contribute to poor or worsening functional outcomes. These self-regulatory skills build upon each other, and any single level of interference tends to have a negative impact on future self-regulation. And just one comment, more information about these issues can be found in the digital handout that you have. In that handout, I talk in some more detail about the specific brain functioning involved if you're interested in that. And I also provide two sets of references, one related to traumatic brain injury and functional outcomes, and the second set of references related to these aspects of automaticity that I've described.